China's top diplomat says the nation is ready to get relations with the United States back on track. Hello, I'm Einar Tangen, and this is The Heat. Ties between China and the United States took a hit under the Trump administration as both sides clashed on a number of issues, ranging from the handling of the coronavirus pandemic to trade and technology and Hong Kong's national security law. Now, China is hoping to turn a page and usher in a new era in China-U.S. ties. So how will the Biden administration respond? Earlier, I spoke with the former U.S. Commerce Secretary and former ambassador to China, Gary Locke. I asked him if years of tension and acrimony under Trump would change under President Joe Biden.
I think the tone of the relationship and the manner in which the relationship is conducted will change. But the issues that President Trump and his administration were trying to address, as well as the issues under President Obama, those are all the same. And certainly they are very significant issues, and you will see a Biden administration approaching them with great seriousness.
What do you see as the major issues that preoccupy the two countries?
Well, obviously the trade and economic issues that led to the I think, short-sighted tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. Those underlying issues about access, about subsidies, about closed markets, and theft of intellectual property, as well as a lack of rule of law, those are all still very, very important to America. American companies, American workers, and certainly American policymakers. Those are the fundamental issues that divide the United States and China. These are issues that America has long complained about, that China really has not aggressively worked on, contrary to their promises when they joined the WTO. So how we approach those, however, I think will be different under a Biden administration. But these are very, very serious, contentious issues.
We have been hearing some of the sentiments from the United States new administration from Antony Blinken, the new Secretary of State. He was asked about the relationship with China during his confirmation hearings in the U.S. Senate. This is part of what he had to say. Let's listen.
As we look at China, there is no doubt that it poses the most significant challenge of any nation state to the United States in terms of our interests, the interests of the American people. There are, as I see it, rising adversarial aspects to the relationship, certainly competitive ones, and still some cooperative ones when it is in our mutual interest.
So, Ambassador Locke, listening to those comments there from Antony Blinken, it seems to point to a central issue in the relationship, and that is whether the United States regards China as a rival or a competitor or strategic competitor, as we've heard sometimes, or as a partner.
Well, it's really all three, as Secretary of State Blinken indicated. Certainly there are many areas of mutual interest in areas of cooperation, whether it's medical research, whether it's fighting climate change and providing clean energy, to fighting piracy off the coast of Africa, to peacekeeping missions throughout the world. At the same time, obviously many of our companies are competitors. China makes, many of its companies make excellent products, and so do American companies. And so both countries and both businesses are trying to sell their products and services around the world. And that competition oftentimes is really good for the ultimate consumer. It keeps, it really promotes efficiency and high quality and constant innovation of those products. As well as we're rivals, and we have different views, world views. Different views of how the world should be conducted and conduct itself, to relationships among other countries. And so it is a very complex relationship, but perhaps the most important consequential relationship to the entire world. Quite frankly, China benefits from a prosperous America, and America benefits from a prosperous China. And the world is looking for leadership from both China and the United States joining together to solve some of the most difficult issues facing the entire globe. China cannot do it alone. The United States cannot do it alone.
Does it have to be a zero-sum game, Ambassador, as some Chinese officials have been warning?
No, I don't think America has ever said it's a zero-sum game. And America welcomes a greater prosperity of all countries, whether it's China or parts of Africa or Latin America, and certainly Europe and throughout Asia. So we want to see people's standard of living rise. We want to see people educated and prosperous and healthy. And again, there are many basic universal goals that everyone should subscribe to.
China's highest-ranking diplomat, Yang Jiechi, has been talking about the relationship with the United States. He talked about it in an address to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. He did warn in the address that the U.S. should not interfere in China's domestic interests. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
China is prepared to work with the United States to move the relationship forward along the track of no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation for the well-being of both countries and peoples. In the meantime, we will continue to stand firm as we defend our sovereignty, security, and development interests.
So, Ambassador Yang Jiechi, he went on to say there that Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang are issues which were, quote, a red line that must not be crossed. What are your thoughts on what he had to say there?
Well, but there are also universal principles of human rights and basic freedoms that even China subscribes to, and it's even part of China's constitution. These are universal values. And certainly, while we don't want to interfere in the internal policies of China, just as we don't want Russia or any other country to interfere in the domestic policy of the United States. But I think there's a responsibility for all nations of the world to call out abuses of these basic human rights and human dignities.
During the Trump years, the relationship was marked by tariffs and the trade war. You talked about that a moment ago. We know that President Biden has signed a number of executive orders shortly after he came to office to undo much of what the previous administration had done. But we are hearing now that this administration is conducting a review of the relationship with China. It's been called an interagency review, and they're even reviewing an agreement that President Trump signed with the Chinese. That was phase one of that trade deal. What does this tell us?
Well, it shows that the Biden administration is going to be very, very thoughtful in re-examining all the policies of the Trump administration, many of which were ill-conceived, very punitive toward people of so many countries around the world, and really led to an isolation of the United States as well as internal division within America. These are welcomed reviews by very competent people, highly ethical people whose sole interest is really making sure that America is safe and secure and will be prosperous, and that we work in concert with other nations. As I said earlier, America has serious issues with China. They are long-standing issues. They did not come up and crop up overnight. But the Trump administration's approach, I think, was ill-conceived and really hurt the American consumer and the American public. These tariffs, unilateral tariffs, which then that we imposed on China, which then China retaliated with its own tariffs on American goods and services, simply hurt American businesses and American consumers. And whereas countries around the world have similar concerns about China's trade and economic policies, they actually benefited from this trade war between the United States and China. These other countries with similar concerns about China's practices, economic practices, should be joining with the United States, and we need to form a have a unified approach in addressing these issues.
We've talked a lot about the issues that divide the two countries, but should there be more focus on the issues that where these countries could cooperate with each other, thinking of things like the fight against climate change, of course the battle against the COVID-19 pandemic that we are seeing right now, fighting terrorism, macroeconomic issues?
Oh, most definitely. There are so many areas of cooperation, and the United States and Chinese scientists and academics and researchers, clean energy specialists have long been working together, and those efforts need to continue, whether it's finding a cure for some of the most dreaded diseases in the world, such as cancer, or even the new strains of TB that are cropping up throughout Asia, to, of course, having a unified, quick, coordinated global response to any future pandemics. And of course, trying to halt the proliferation of nuclear weapons, whether it's in North Korea or certainly in other parts of the world. China and the United States were very integral and worked very closely together with the other nations of the National Security Council of the United Nations in the original agreement for Iran to stop developing nuclear materials. Obviously, the Trump administration ended that agreement to the consternation of people and countries and leaders all around the world. But that just shows the potential of cooperation between China, the United States, and many other countries. Those areas of cooperation must continue.
This has been called the most important bilateral relationship in the world. How high a priority is the relationship for the Biden administration? We know that right now the United States has got a lot of issues to deal with, the COVID-19 pandemic for one, and we've seen issues of security over the past few weeks being another.
Oh, it's a very high priority because, as you rightly indicated, and this is the view of so many countries around the world, that the U.S.-China relationship is the most important, consequential bilateral relationship in the world today. What happens between the United States and China affects not just our two countries, but affects countries all around the world. And so many of the issues that the world faces can only be solved with a partnership, a collaboration between the United States and China.
Ambassador Gary Locke, thanks so much for joining us. Well, for more now on China-U.S. ties, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. With us here in Washington, Harlan Ullman is chairman of the Killowen Group and senior advisor of the Atlantic Council. Also with us here in Washington, Yukon Huang is senior fellow at the Carnegie Asia program. Welcome to all of you. And Einar Tangen, let me start with you. Listening there to Ambassador Gary Locke, one of the things he said was that the United States has serious issues with China. And I was just wondering, it seems that the United States wants good relations with China, but is putting preconditions in this. China has to come into compliance with what the United States wants before relations can be improved. What did you think?
Well, I think the problem here is Gary didn't recognize the underlying problem here, which is China's 40 years of success. And I'm not saying that to be Pollyannish. I'm just saying that if China was not successful today, we would not be talking about this. So at the same time that the U.S. is going forward with this idea that there's a complex relationship with China, it's in essence said that the bully tactics of Donald Trump didn't work, and now they're going to go back to the drawing board and try to get a gang of people, a mob of people together, of countries, who can force China to do, in essence, what Donald Trump was trying to do. But there are some inconsistencies here. Primary among them, he's talked about trade and opening up, gave a litany of problems that China has, from intellectual property to opening up markets. But then Joe Biden goes ahead and says, look, buy American. I'm going to ensure that the U.S. government is only buying an American. And you see that the same kind of hypocrisy in terms of human rights. The U.S. is saying that there are areas in China that there should be some sort of universal recognition. But at the same time, the U.S. is responsible for wars overseas, and also Guantanamo Bay, and we could go on quite a bit. The U.S. is in an awkward position at the moment because it's championing a system that it is unable to impose on itself. The Capitol riots have put things in sharp focus.
Harlan Ullman, recently at the White House there was a news conference where the White House press secretary was asked about the relationship with China, and this is what she had to say. Let's listen.
Our view, the president's view, is we need to play a better defense, which must include holding China accountable, for its unfair and illegal practices and making sure that American technologies aren't facilitating China's military buildup.
So here again, Harlan, we're hearing this very hawkish view on China. I mean, that could quite easily have come out of the Trump administration. Not much of a change, although, as Gary Locke told us, Ambassador Gary Locke told us, there is a change in tone. Do you think there could be much of a change under the new administration?
There needs to be, but the rather cynical and realistic issues and comments that were raised by the first speaker, not Gary Locke, I think are really quite interesting. The one area where the U.S. Congress agrees is that China is the #1 facing threat. If you had watched the confirmation hearings of both the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the latter today, there's no doubt in Congress, China is the threat. And so I think that there's an ideological problem here where America is viewing China much more as an adversary than China needs to be. We are assuming that China is the #1 adversary competitor to the United States. Nobody has done an analysis to look at Chinese weaknesses, really make that case. And so I'm afraid what's going to happen is we're going to get the worst of the Trump administration exacerbated by the good intentions of the Biden administration. If you read what the new National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has written, what Kurt Campbell, who's going to be the coordinator for Asia, has written, it's clear that there's going to be a combination of confrontation, conflict, competition, and coexistence and cooperation. But I think that we're doing it from the American perspective and not really from the Chinese perspective. And I hope the Biden administration looks much more seriously at the downsides and weaknesses of China and does not immediately assume that China is the massive threat. For example, our military strategy is predicated on preventing China from taking over Taiwan. That is an extraordinarily difficult military feat. In 1944, the Americans planned to take 4,000 ships and 400,000 sailors and Marines to take Taiwan back from the Japanese who had occupied it since 1895. Yeah. And so I think we're exaggerating some of the Chinese capabilities. There's no doubt that China is a growing economy. It's a powerful economy, but I fear that we don't fully understand China. And if you look at the past mistakes in American policy of not fully understanding other countries, right. The Soviet Union, nobody thought it was going to implode. I fear we're making the same mistakes here and not fully understanding China, and therefore our policies are likely to be flawed.
Right, Harlan, very briefly, if China is seen as a threat, then is it the U.S. policy to contain this rise of China rather than forge a partnership on an equal basis?
It'll be a tension between the two. On the military side, that's exactly what's going to happen. John Kerry, in terms of environment, is going to want to work cooperatively with China. I think what needs to happen is that Joe Biden and Xi Jinping need to sit down, not for 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours. Henry Kissinger spent hours, days in China, speaking to Joe and speaking to Mao. Yeah. There needs to be a fuller understanding about what both sides need to do, what the limitations are, and coming to an agreement. And quite frankly, American focus on what China is doing in Hong Kong and with the Uyghurs is not going to be helpful, even though we know what is going on is wrong.
Okay, I want to get to Yukon, but before that, Einar, I want to get briefly your response to what we've just heard. China is seen as a threat.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that goes back to my original contention. It's an existential threat. The U.S. prides itself on having, this kind of American exceptionalist view that democracy, the ballot box, and also, competitive markets are the key to everything. China does not have that system yet. For 40 years, it has continued to thrive. And this is the existential threat. How can you have the best system if somebody doesn't and they're doing better than you? So this is the real basis of the threat and what we should be recognizing and talking about. What has to happen is an understanding that there are different paths to prosperity, and that trying to judge every situation and country by one set of metrics not only doesn't work, but historically has been proven a major fallacy.
Okay, Yukon Huang, it would appear that the tariffs, the trade tariffs that were imposed by the Trump administration are going to stay in place for now. In terms of trade relations, economic relations, where do you see this going?
Well, initially, I don't think there's going to be much difference between Biden's approach and Trump's approach. Biden's also signaled that he's actually a populist and protectionist in some ways with the Buy America programs. He just levied more tariffs on UAE, on aluminum. So I don't see the tariff policy is going to change much. But I think there's going to be a difference in terms of how he deals with the business concerns with China. Business community is not concerned about trade, tariffs, or deficits. It really wants better access. And I think that's an area where there is potential gains. If you look at what Europe was able to do in terms of negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China in last month, many of the concerns that America, the White House is concerned with, actually have been addressed in that treaty. So there's actually a good basis for moving forward on some of the concerns of the business community. It's the third area which is actually causing the problems. It's the security establishment. For several decades, U.S.-China policies have been able to separate economic issues from security issues. Today, they're interwoven, and security issues dominate. And that's why we have the zero-sum game. And then when you talk about security, as everyone's been mentioning, you have to differentiate between what I would say military risks, or is it a question of the governance of the two systems? Actually, I think what is really threatening is the technological concerns that China is a rising innovative power that potentially could displace America's leadership in the high-tech realm in the future. All three of these risks, in my view, are overstated. They can be handled, but you need something to think about because the technological risk is completely new and different.
Harlan, in that address, yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I didn't hear what was happening from Beijing. I had no volume.
Oh, okay. Harlan, a question I had for you. We were talking earlier on about that address that was made by Yang Jiechi, who is China's highest-ranking diplomat. This is what he had to say about the future of China-U.S. relations. Let's listen.
The Trump administration adopted misguided policies against China, plunging the relationship into its most difficult period since the establishment of diplomatic ties. A strong case is made for cooperation instead of confrontation between China and the United States.
You know, Harlan, in diplomatic terms, we often hear diplomats talk about confidence-building measures before they get down to issues of substance. In this case, what are the confidence-building issues that we should see first?
First of all, we need far stronger military-to-military relationships. Second, there needs to be a major summit between President Xi and President Biden that lasts for several days. Second, I think we have to drop the notion of these sort of red lines where if China does this, we're going to do that. My biggest concern is not that China does not pose a rivalry to us. They steal our intellectual property. That's absolutely clear. But in fact, the venture capital market in China makes ours look very, very mild. China socially, politically, philosophically is far different, and we don't really fully understand those differences. And so therefore, I think what the first thing that we need to do is to take a look at the vulnerabilities of China. They've got an underclass of perhaps 500 billion, a real estate bubble, huge debt, riots in the tens of thousands each particular year, demographic problems with an aging society. As a matter of fact, Russians have 3 times the standard of living in terms of average wage than China does. And so we've got to understand the problems of China as well as Chinese aspirations. But too often we think about that foreign countries should think the way we do, and it's very difficult for us to recognize that there are fundamental differences. We've got to get across that. There is no reason why there needs to be a conflict or confrontation between China and its neighbors of the United States. China has been far less aggressive than the United States. Yeah. The last time, aside from the dust-up in the Himalayas with India, they made any kind of a military move was in 1979 in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese basically took out a Chinese division. And so we have to understand there are fundamental differences. Yes, there are huge areas where we disagree, but we need a sensible, mature relationship. And quite frankly, given the congressional views and the views of the American public, we are viewing China too much as an enemy, and that's a bad state. Nixon changed that. Mm-hmm. Remember, we fought a war with China in Korea. China was the enemy. Right. And yet Nixon was able to change that. Will Joe Biden be able to do a Nixon, and will Xi be able to do a Mao and a Zhou Enlai. On that basis rests the future of the relationship.
Right. Einar Tangen, I want to talk for a moment about these red lines. China has red lines. It has talked about them. Yang Jiechi has talked about that in his speech. He was very clear that issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang are domestic issues, and the country won't tolerate any kind of meddling or interference in those issues. Yet we heard from Ambassador Gary Locke earlier on saying that there are also what he called universal issues, like human rights, that must be addressed. What would you say to that?
Well, as I said before, I mean, it's curious. Gary brings this up. This is going to be the rallying cry for creating the grand coalition, or I call it the mob. You know, when bully tactics don't work, you get a mob of people together. And in essence, you know, the U.S. could look fairly hypocritical in this regard. You know, the U.S. is responsible for the largest number of refugees in the world through the various wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. I don't know that the U.S. is in a position to be, as I said, preaching from the bully pulpit when it can't even have a very peaceful transition of power. So at this point, I think Gary is, you know, I think he means well, but I don't think that he's rationally thought through this idea of interfering in other people's countries. Also, to address one thing that Harlan said, I don't think it's useful to start looking at the weaknesses of all the countries. There are tremendous weaknesses out there. And there are tremendous opportunities to work together, whether it's COVIX, climate change, piracy, peace, trade. The U.S. does not have a major multilateral trade deal. It's withdrawn from almost everything. It needs to go there. So rather than looking for weaknesses, let's look for combined strengths.
Can I make
very quickly, Harlan, because I want to get to Yukon for a comment as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, look, the reason I say we look at Chinese vulnerabilities is we ignore them. We see China as a rising superpower that's omnipotent. If we take a look at the vulnerabilities that the Chinese leadership faces, they are real, and they should help measure our own policies. We look at China as being entirely strong, and unless we understand that, our policies are going to be misdirected.
Okay, Yukon, very quickly, I've got about 30 seconds. Look, it's generally recognized that there's a lot of work that's got to be done, but China, in the meantime, has been forging relationships with other partners. We see that in Asia, in that region, as well as we saw that recent relationship with that deal that was signed with the European Union. How does that change things?
Well, China doesn't have what I call America's soft power, so its links with other countries is basically forged through economic relationships, trade, foreign investment, the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's forged an investment agreement with Europe. It's the RCEP trade agreement in Asia. It's now indicated interest in joining the revised TPP. And I think that's China's strategy. How do I establish these kinds of investment links, economic links? They don't have what I call the same kind of leverage as America has in terms of the soft power links.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.